So let us now get these things configured over on the DFSR side so that we can then make the DFSN side just that much more highly available. Here on my machine, file 1, I already have all that content. So we've created that share, company shared. We have all the content on this machine. I want to show you that I actually have another machine here called file 2. File 2 is just another computer here in my Active Directory domain. It could be in a different Active Directory site if we wanted to configure it in that way. But effectively, this is another machine in some other geographic location where users need to access that content in that company shared location. I have on this machine also already installed the DFSR role service that's associated with the file services role. That installation of DFSR is required on both sides of this relationship so that it can manage all the content that needs to be transferred backwards and forwards. In order for us to create a replication relationship, we can come back here to DFS management and create what is called a new replication group. Now we have two different kinds of replication groups we can create. The first of which is one that is used for most of the use cases that DFSR works with. This is a multi-purpose replication group up here. In a multi-purpose replication group, this is essentially two different machines, or two or more machines really, that exist in a replication relationship. You can use this for the sharing of resources so that people in both locations can access content and have that content replicated to the other side. There is a special use case down here at the bottom, which is called a replication group for data collection. And this is for a specific use case where you have a remote site computer, so some other file server way out in a remote site somewhere, that you want to replicate the content one directionally back to your hub site, so to your main office site, for the purposes of backing it up. Now, this does not configure the backup component of actually backing up this data. This is just replicating it from that remote site to the local site so that your other probably third-party backup or Windows Server backup solution could then back it up to disk or tape. This bottom item down here just simply configures the inbound replication so that it'll be on this machine once that backup occurs on a nightly basis. We're going to create a multi-purpose replication group up here because this is the one that most organizations make use of. For this replication group, let's go ahead and configure this as the company shared replication group. We can put in a description if we want. We can put in the domain if we want. More importantly than anything, we need to put in here these two servers that are going to participate. I'm going to choose in here to add in file 1 and then also to add in file 2. As part of actually configuring these, it will go about verifying whether or not DFS has been installed on these two machines. And also if the remote machine and the local machine can speak to each other. There's no, for example, firewalls that are getting in the way. As you can see here, we've passed all the tests, so file 1 and file 2 can participate in this replication group. So I'll choose here next to identify what topology for the replication I'm interested in. Now, in most situations, you'll find yourself configuring what is called a full mesh topology. The idea being here that both halves of the replication are intended to be kind of peer-to-peer. So a person may change something on file 2, or a person may change something on file 1, and that change needs to be replicated over to the other server. In a situation where you have 3 or more machines, where you have the need to disseminate information, but not so much replicate the information back, you can choose what's called a hub and spoke topology up here at the top. Again, as you can see down here, it works well in publication scenarios where you just need to simply publish information out to different machines. Imagine, for example, you had a series of web servers, all of which participated in some sort of cluster. Well, when those web servers need to get changed, you could configure them in a hub and spoke configuration so that a single change to a file could then be automatically replicated out to each web server as part of this DFSR replication. In our case, we'll choose the full mesh configuration here because anything that changes on file 2 is going to come back to file 1 and vice versa. I'll choose next here, and I can configure the replication group schedule and bandwidth, which for now I'm just going to leave the default configurations. We'll come back to this here in just a second. I then need to configure what the primary member will be. Now in our case, when we're first setting this up, this is going to be the member that contains the data, so file 1. On file 1, that is the initial copy of the data that has to get moved over to file 2. Now, when we do that, when we choose the primary member here, we obviously need to choose the folders to be replicated, and I can add them here by choosing to browse, and then to identify here on the E drive that company shared location that we were looking at just a second ago. When we configure this on the remote servers, we'll choose the same name here, company shared, or I could configure a custom name. And then down under permissions, this is where I could either configure the permissions, so do I want to set permissions in that remote location, or do I want to use the existing permissions that are already there? In many situations, it can be a good idea for you to configure the target folder and also the target folder permissions, share permissions, and NTFS permissions first before you go about initiating the replication. You can go about configuring your custom permissions here, but I've had generally in the past a better experience with ensuring manually that those permissions and the folders have been configured in both locations first. I'll choose down here OK, and then choose Next. And it's here where we can identify what the local path should be on those other members. So over on file 2, where will that local path be? If I come here under Edit, it's here where I can identify what the local path should be. I need to choose to enable the membership status here. If I choose to disable it, I won't do any replication at all. And then down here where I want to configure the local path to be, which on that server will be the C company shared location. Now I'm pointing this out very specifically because on my initial server, that company shared folder is on the E drive. Over here, it's on the C drive of this other machine. And I do this kind of on purpose to illustrate that you can actually have different locations where these replications exist. Because later on, when we start to reconfigure our DFS namespace, we're going to configure that DFS namespace to point to either company shared location indifferent of which drive letter it's on. So down here, I'm going to plug a company shared here on the C drive, again, just to show you an example of why and how I would end up moving these things into different locations. I could down here choose to make the replicated folder on this member read-only, which is the single way in which you can make this a one-directional replication. In every case, DFS is a bi-directional replication unless you configure that remote location to be read-only. In our case, we want people to be able to access content and change content on both servers, so we won't actually configure it as being read-only. When I choose OK here, and then Next, and then Create, that will go about creating the replication group, creating the connections, and then beginning the process of replicating this content from one server to another. You'll see in creating this, we get a little dialog box up here that illustrates that our Active Directory replication can sometimes slow down the process of getting this replication kicked off. In our environment right now, I just have that single domain controller DC powered on, so there's really no sense of replication, and nor do we have multiple Active Directory sites that could inhibit replication because of site settings. So for here, we'll just click OK through the box, because just as soon as this thing gets itself ready to go, it will begin that process of replicating information from our server file 1 over to our server file 2. And in fact, if we give it just a second or two, we can pop up over here to our server file 2 and just see the status of the replication. Let me come down here to Explorer and then go to the C drive and take a look at companies shared where, yep, it looks like we've already begun replication here. We've got a couple of folders of content. And indeed, there's some subfolders there, and in fact, some articles there as well. So this process doesn't take very long when you've got a very small amount of data. But as you can imagine, if I've got an extremely large amount of data, terabytes of data, this whole replication process could take a pretty extended period of time to get that initial replication complete. A little later on in this module, we'll talk about ways in which you can speed that process up. But for now, recognize that this is sort of the simplest way in which you can configure a DFSR replication group.